Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and in this video I wanted to discuss a somewhat intriguing discovery coming from a very salty lake somewhere in California. A lake that you see right here, known as the Mono Lake, and a lake that's a little bit too extreme for most life to survive. It's actually super salty, and so not a lot of life can be discovered inside of it. But apparently there was something always hiding here, and only discovered extremely recently by the scientists whose study we're discussing today. And it's a discovery that's sort of visible right here. This might not actually make sense at first, but what you look at it right here is an extremely strange flagellated eukaryote, or essentially a complex eukaryotic cell that has a flagella that allows it to move, that's able to form these very bizarre colonies, symbiotic with a lot of bacteria, in some sense mimicking what's sort of happening in, for example, our guts. But much more importantly, this organism is essentially a kind of a missing step between unicellular life and multicellular life. In other words, the scientists might have just discovered one of the most perfect models to try to understand how multicellular complex life evolved on planet Earth. And so let's talk about this a little bit more, but let's actually start with similar organisms that have been known to us for almost 200 years. Here's actually a much older drawing of this from 1886, and these are known as Choanoflagellates, a really large group of free-living cells that surprisingly resemble human sperm in a lot of different ways. Here's a real picture of one of these organisms, in this case isolated from Siberian soil. But generally speaking, Choanoflagellates look sort of like this. In terms of shape, structure, and locomotion, they're strangely similar to sperm. And they actually use their flagellates not just for motion, but to also try to suck up as much food as possible. So basically they have a very distinct morphology that's not present in pretty much any other cell. And so here, surprisingly, their flagellum seems to have at least two purposes. It's sort of used as a kind of a vacuum cleaner to suck up food, and obviously for motion. And here they can actually consume quite a lot. They're known to eat smaller bacteria, but they also absorb a lot of other food particles and even viruses. And so in that sense, even as a single cell, there's a lot of very intriguing, unique stuff about them. But some of the members of this group are also able to do something entirely different. They're able to create colonies. And this colony formation seems to have independently evolved at least several times within this group. And though the shape of these colonies generally can be pretty different, it's usually something round and something relatively small. Here's actually something a little bit more unusual, with a lot more cells inside. And because these are eukaryotes, and also because they're able to form these relatively complex structures, for a very long time biologists believed that maybe these unusual organisms are a kind of a stepping stone to multicellular life. In other words, these unusual structures show us the potential beginning of all multicellular life, and specifically animal life, on planet Earth. But the actual model and the actual reconstruction in this case has always been a little bit challenging. But at first, not everyone accepted this, with many scientists believing that maybe this was just a coincidence. For example, these unusual planktonic clumps might have evolved much later, when the early animals already existed. Okay, I keep saying animals. In biological terms, here we're talking about what's known as a metazoan. And the simplest known metazoan to us, or I guess once again, the simplest animal, is this, a sponge. The most basic metazoan on the entire planet, and potentially the oldest of them all. But intriguingly, both sponges and choanoflagellates seem to have an extremely similar basic structure. And I mean, just look at this. Extremely similar. Except that one forms a sponge, the other one usually forms nothing. And though once again here this was initially thought to be maybe a coincidence, or just something that evolved morphological similarities, mostly due to evolutionary pressure, here the relation is much closer than the scientists initially thought. By comparing mitochondrial genome, researchers confirmed the placement of choanoflagellates as a kind of a cousin of all metazoans, basically once again animals. In other words, this is definitely that missing link, with metazoans eventually evolving into sponges at first, and then becoming more and more complex over time. Or at least that's how the story goes. Except that choanoflagellates, unlike metazoans, do not create permanent formations. They can change shape, and they can definitely fall apart. But in this particular example, what you're looking at is one of the discoveries from 2019, when we actually witnessed something we've never seen before. Here, choanoflagellates also seem to actually show a kind of a colonial behavior. So once again, kind of like early animals. They seem to be able to coordinate with each other by responding to light and by changing their shape and their position. So once again, just a little bit more clues in terms of their connection to some of our ancestors, making them a really important model for trying to figure out that unusual common ancestor that basically formed all of us. Today it's believed that this split must have happened over 600 million years ago during the late Precambrian, but possibly even as far back as 780 million years ago based on recent genetic analysis. But there's actually something else really important that you might see in this video, something else that seems to be interacting with these Choanoflagellates that's sort of visible all over the place. Now in this case it's a very minuscule amount, but one of the major discoveries from the recent study is essentially kind of visible here. Okay, I mean, this is maybe difficult to understand, but once again you're looking at that colony, in this case surrounded by a really large amount of bacteria. Bacteria that in this case are visible in orange and, as you'll see in a second, in red on the inside. Now this is just a 3D model based on the observations from the microscope, but in essence this is an incredible discovery for, I guess, several reasons. First of all, this shows us a symbiosis between extremely ancient eukaryotes and microbes that seem to actually play a really important role in helping these Choanoflagellates, I guess in some sense, live better lives. And so this is basically the first ever discovery of a multicellular colony with a microbiome, kind of like what we have pretty much everywhere on our body, with the most important microbiome being inside our guts. And by the way, if you want to find out about how important it is, check out the videos in the description, but also once again showing us a very interesting colonial organism we've never seen before that seems to form these very bizarre spherical balls. And if you look close enough, and obviously if you've done any anatomy, you might see what this resembles. This resembles a typical embryo that's approximately several days old. An embryo where the cells have not differentiated yet and have not formed junctions. In other words, one of the main reasons this is so interesting is because it basically resembles what's known as a blastula, a ball of cells that always forms during animal development that then leads to more complexity and development of symmetry, organs, limbs, and so on. And well, strangely enough, this is pretty much exactly what we're seeing here as well, because in this case, researchers also detected several connective structures and of course had a lot of the bacteria that seem to assist these organisms in some way. Now exactly what the bacteria is doing here is currently unknown, but it's actually believed to be related to the toxic environment inside the lake. Or at least that's one of the potential suggestions. Because this lake contains a lot of salt, but also arsenic and even cyanide, it is not a particularly friendly environment. But a lot of bacteria, especially extremophiles, love this stuff. And so it is quite possible that maybe one of the functions these bacteria serve is to basically provide a bit of a detox and a bit of a protection, which is not very different from what we actually get from bacteria inside our guts or even on our skin. Or maybe this was some kind of a farm. Maybe these bacteria were being farmed in order to eat them later. And if so, this would also make this the first ever miniature farm. A farm created by a very simple organism that we've never seen before. And so at this point, pretty much everything else is just going to be guesswork. Only future studies and future experiments can actually tell us what these bacteria are doing here and how this possibly connects to microbiome in a lot of other animals out there. But just the fact that these microbes seem to form these really large structures around these Choanoflagellates is already super strange. Intriguingly though, some of these bacteria seem to kind of act like aphrodisiacs. They essentially seem to stimulate sexual behavior and cause these Choanoflagellates to create new cells. So this is definitely not just food, with this newly discovered organism now referred to as Barroeca monosierra. But at least for now, that's pretty much all we know. Once there are more discoveries, or once the scientists discovered something else about multicellular life, we'll come back and talk more about this in some of the future videos. Until then, thank you for watching, subscribe, share this with someone who loves to know about space and sciences, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support the show on Patreon by joining channel membership, or by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt you can find in the description. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.